Okay, thank you very much. There are a couple of things which Kim didn't mention. So the one thing which makes me very happy is seeing Kim wearing white pants, because that suggests that summer has started, right? Like as a Midwesterner, I've always had trouble with these sort of seasonal dress codes. You know, when I was a kid working in Washington, I would try to wear my shorts. I was working for an English economist, and after September, I was still wearing my shorts, and he said, "You know, Tim, I think Labor Day is behind us, right?" And I took the hint, and since then, like, I just wear a suit all the time, right? I just decided that's just safest. The second thing which Kim neglected to mention is that this day is timed in a very special way. I'm talking about my book, The Road to Unfreedom, which is a big, fat, heavy book. If you buy it now, you can decide by 4 o'clock whether that becomes the book, which Ms. Braun is going to tear apart in front of your eyes. So this is not at all accidental. We've actually planned this. I mean, so right after my talk, there's a little thing at Atticus across the street where I'm going to go, and I'm going to sign your books if you want to buy the book, and then you have an hour or so to decide what you think. What's the verdict? Do I read, or do I victimize Professor Snyder? Okay. So this book really is all about time. On Tyranny, which Kim was kind enough to mention, is about what to do now. It's about what to do right now so things don't get much worse. But this book that I'm going to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so it actually existed before On Tyranny. This book is the book which allowed me to write On Tyranny. This book was actually done in the fall of 2016 when I published On Tyranny. The reason I published On Tyranny when I did was because I thought we don't have very much time. The things that I think I understand about the 2010s, about the present, I need to get out now in a form which people can find useful. But the reason why I thought a lot of the things that I did and the sources for a lot of the lessons that I gave in that book are actually in this larger book that I'm going to be talking about today. So this is a different kind of book. It's a history book. It's a history book about the present, which is meant to situate us in where we are. So it ends up, by no coincidence whatsoever, it ends up landing where On Tyranny starts. It ends with the idea that history is what we make of it, but its purpose is to show us what that history actually is, where we're actually standing right now. And it begins precisely, I was joking about time, but it begins precisely with the idea of time. Time is a very powerful idea. The way that we live in time is perhaps the most important thing about our politics. And one of the powerful things about time is that we don't realize that we live in different forms of time. So, I mean, one can do this in very simple ways. Like, I can say the Arts and Ideas Festival is an annual thing. It comes around in a cycle of once a year. And so from the point of view of the organizers, here I am after a year, right? From my point of view, this is the 63rd lecture I've given on this campus, right, in this academic year. So from my point of view, it's much more linear time moving forward, right? Here I am again on a stage. Another way to think about time is by looking back, right? So I came to Yale for the first time in 1989 because that's when my brother was a freshman here. And so every once in a while when I walk around Yale, I catch myself thinking of myself not as the professor, but as the person who was coming down to see, which particularly dangerous female was on my brother's case at that particular time. My brother was and is the opposite of dangerous. Oh, hi, Phil, if you're watching this. Hi, all those women from Yale 93, if you're watching this. Okay, but the point is that I say this in a light way because there's a heavier point, which is that the way we live in time is very important politically. And I think figuring out why things are so dangerous now, but also why things are so strange now, requires us to think a little bit about time. What happens to us, and I think what is happening to us now, is that we can shift from one way of seeing time to another way of seeing time very quickly. And then when we've shifted, we don't realize what's happened to us. We think, oh, it was always like this. Okay, what do I mean? Let me try to be specific. In 1989, let me just start then. In 1989, it seemed like there were no alternatives. Communism was over. Capitalism seemed triumphant. People talked about, every time I say this phrase, 10 days go off my life, but I'm going to say it anyway. People talked about the end of history, right? The notion was that now that the Berlin Wall has fallen, now that the Soviet Union is weak, it's soon going to fall apart. The way that we do things is the only way to do things. This is what I call the politics of inevitability. A short word for it is progress. The idea that the future is going to be just like the present, but more and better of the present. The idea that we know the rules of how the present becomes the future. Now, there are a couple of problems with this idea. One of the problems with this idea is that it completely takes responsibility away. If we know how things are going to go anyway, it doesn't really matter what you or I do. The other thing is that it deprives all meaning of actual facts. So if something happens which seems to contradict this general trend, you just treat it as a blip, as a bump in the road, as a speed bump on the highway towards this better future. But then the other problem, the fundamental problem, the thing we're experiencing now, is that this idea of progress, this notion that we know the rules, this feeling that there's only one course of history and we're on it, this eventually cracks. It cracks for everybody. For different times, different places, different reasons, but I think by the time we've gotten to 2018, it's broken for most Americans. It broke for a lot of people because of wealth inequality. Like the notion that things are getting better has to do with the notion that you're doing materially better. It just does, I'm sorry, for most people that's very important. If you're an American born in 1945, your chances of doing better than your parents were about 90%. If you were born in 1980, your chances were about 50%, and it's only gone down since then. The idea of progress or inevitability broke for a lot of people in 2008. Just to take a simple example, whether you can own a home or not is very important to people's sense of whether they're moving ahead in time. If you can leave your parents' house. If you're between 18 and 34 in the United States, the most likely place you're living is with your parents. It's hard for people to believe that they're moving forward in time. In those conditions, of course, students out there, I love your parents, and I know you do too, but there's a point I'm trying to make here. No, it's not about how you need to move out. No, that's not my point at all. It's about how you should be living in the library. That's my view. For a lot of people, it broke in November of 2016. Right? A lot of people were snapped out of this kind of sleepwalking into the future in November of 2016 when an unexpected person was elected president. When this happens, the temptation is the gravity pulls you towards another idea of time, which I call in the book the politics of eternity. And that's the idea that the good things are in the past. If the good things are gone, it's because somebody else took them away from us. The immigrants, the blacks, the Jews, the Muslims, some outsider took those things away from us. And that's the way that history works. It's not a straight line to the future. History is a cycle. And the same thing happens over and over again. Those outsiders come and they take the things that belong to us. And so you begin to think nostalgically about a past, which is almost never the way you think it was. And the way that you think about the present starts to be about us and them. And the future disappears entirely. In the politics of eternity, the time is just a loop. And people forget, you notice this is happening, people forget that the purpose of government is to make policy for the future. If you like this kind of politics, and people do, you're happy to indulge in these cycles of looking back, of thinking about America being great again, or thinking about America first, which is a slogan, of course, from the 1930s. If you don't like this kind of thing, you're very often still caught in it because you get caught in this cycle of the daily outrage. You get bombarded with the bad news or the meme of the day, and you're so outraged, you're emotionally so spent that you too end up, in effect, agreeing that there isn't a future, that everything is cyclical. And we're all caught in this idea of us and them. Now, these ideas about time are very powerful and very important because they affect not just us, they affect everyone. The case that I'm trying to make in the book, and here's where I'm going to start talking about Russia, is that this shift from forward-looking time to cyclical time, from inevitability to eternity, from progress to doom, that this shift happened first in Russia. And if we understand how it happened in Russia, then we can begin to understand how Russia affected us. So this whole book that I'm going to tell you about is about the Russia story. This whole book is about how Russia chose our president, but rather than leaping to the sordid details, tempting and familiar and fun to recite as they are, what I'm trying to do is to find a larger pattern of history and to see what happened to us as an example of a general trend. Because only, I think, when we see ourselves in context as one among others, do we have a chance of understanding ourselves. Part of the shock of 2016 is the feeling that, oh, how could this happen? That nothing like this has ever happened before, right? That's how Americans react to sudden events. Americans have two reactions to sudden events, right? One is, it's not happening. And the other is, it's never happened to anyone before, right? So what can we possibly do? The point of a history of contemporary life is to show that it is happening, but to explain it in such a way that we can see the commonalities with things that have happened to other people, the connections to other people's history. And in this case, the connections to Russia are the ones that are extremely important. I want to note something very important before I start talking about Russia. My whole point now is not that Russia is some alien planet which has just used its magical powers on us. Sorry, I mixed metaphors. Aliens don't have magic. Aliens have science. Like pixies have magic. Okay, but the whole point is the point is that Russia is in this story with us, right? The story is all one story, and the point of understanding Russia is not to be more critical of Russia. I mean, I can do that too, but the point of understanding Russia is to understand where we are and to understand how we got where we are. So, Russian politics. What Russia has managed to do is it's managed to arrive at the politics of eternity first and land there and find a stable way to exist there and then to spread the politics of eternity outwards. Russia has a very traditional problem in government, the most traditional problem you can have, which is the problem of succession. Okay. That problem is unfamiliar because we don't have it yet. The problem of succession is, how do you maintain the state? How do you maintain the government while changing leaders? That seems easy to us because we have democracy, sort of. But in history, that is the single hardest thing to get over. It's very easy to have a situation where somebody crashes and steals and then divides the booty among his friends, right? You in the front row are my friends for the purpose of this exercise. That's very easy. And then the people in the front row are loyal to me, and we come up with some kind of mystical story about how I'm wonderful and have special powers. That's easy. What's hard is going from that situation to a situation where our little unit survives when I die. Right? That's the creation of a state. That's called succession. And the main reason democracy is such a good thing, or would be such a good thing, the main reason it's such a good thing, is that it offers you a succession principle. It means that after we elect the wrong person, the state's still going to be there. We're going to be there together to vote, right? That's the main thing democracy does. It creates a sense of the near-term future, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why democracy and history are so closely connected. By the end of this, I'm going to be trying to argue that history actually is necessary for democracy. And the fact that we've gone off the rails and forgotten about history is one of the reasons why we are where we are. Okay, but back to Russia. They have the very traditional problem of succession. They have a leader after whose death no one knows what's going to happen, right? So in Russia, no one knows what's going to happen when Mr. Putin dies. I don't mean to insult him by saying he's going to die. We are all going to die, right? Not during my lecture. None of you is going to die during my lecture. It's all going to be fine. But we're all going to die eventually, including Mr. Putin. They're in the very traditional position that no one knows what's going to happen next, right? How do you solve that problem? Well, one way is you have elections. That's now off the table in Russia because what Russia has done in the 21st century is what many other countries have done. They've maintained the ritual of elections while removing the content, which, by the way, is how democracy dies now. Democracy doesn't die in a revolution or a counter-revolution or a coup. It dies by 1,000 cuts. So at some point, it dawns on you that this doesn't mean anything anymore and that you're just going to the ballot box because you have to. At some point, that dawns on you, right? That dawning has already happened in Russia. This very traditional problem in Russia has been solved by applying a modern idea which is fascism. Okay, that's a word that gets thrown around a lot, I know. But fascism actually has content. fascism is a tradition that you can appeal to, and it's a way of solving the problem of succession. It's a way of addressing it. Because what fascism says is, you don't need laws, you don't need institutions, you don't need democracy. All you need is a leader, right? And by the way, as a historian of National Socialism and fascism, there's a reason why I don't like that word, right? The word leader in German is Führer. The word leader in Italian is Duce. In Russian, it's Vojt. I don't like it when we talk about leaders all the time. We don't have leaders in the system. There's also another problem that I've noticed in America, which is, have you noticed that every university is educating its students to be leaders? Like, isn't there a logical problem with that? I think, like, in the Ivy League, we should take turns, and, like, only one of us gets to train leaders, and, like, the other rest of them have to train followers. And we could just take turns so it would be fair. Like, Cornell could have the leaders first, and, you know, no, because we can't all be lead. All right, you get it. So but here what I'm trying to get at is that fascism is a way of dodging this problem. You imagine a mythical leader who somehow comes from beyond history and somehow solves the problem of time. He's charismatic. He says the rules don't apply to him. He denies factuality. There's an aura around him. That's a way of solving this problem, and that's what Mr. Putin has actually done. But Mr. Putin, beyond that, has appealed to specific Russian fascist traditions. He's resuscitated a fascist thinker whose name is Ivan Ilyin, who's done some very interesting things for Russia. And this is, by the way, also a big trend in the 21st century. Taking traditional far-right ideas from the 20s and 30s and 40s of the 20th century and applying them to a postmodern or a 21st century situation. So Mr. Putin has literally dug the body of this elite. Well, he didn't do it with his own hands. He had an oligarch pay for it, which is, of course, what you do, right? I mean, that's how you guys get stuff done, right? You have your oligarch friends pay for it. That's how this whole festival was organized, on that principle. The staff in the back is like, if only it was so easy. We had to raise $35 from these people and $50 from these people. No, it's actually true. So the philosopher Ivan Ilyin died in exile in Switzerland, and Mr. Putin got his oligarch friend, Viktor Vekselberg, to pay for the reinterment of the body. I mention Mr. Vekselberg's name because he is the same Mr. Vekselberg who gave a lot of money to Michael Cohen during the presidential election, because this is, at every level of detail, all one story. It's all one story. Okay. Now, what Ilyin does is that he gives you some ideas. He tells you that, as I talked about before, democracy is only supposed to be a ritual. He tells you that freedom means knowing your place in society. So he says that this is what fascists say. They say this kind of thing. The political system, the society, is a body, right? So we're all like cells, and freedom means knowing your place. This account of freedom is very helpful if you happen to be at the top of an oligarchical clan which runs the whole country. Russia is a system where there is no rule of law in effect, right? Because the money is concentrated in the hands of a very few people. It's the one country, according to Credit Suisse, which has a greater problem with wealth equality than the United States of America. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why Russia is so helpful, because it shows where wealth inequality takes you politically. So this idea that freedom means knowing where you are in society and not ever being able to move around is very helpful if you happen to already control all the money anyway, right? So, I mean, Mr. Putin is a materialist, but not the same way that you and I are materialists. If you already have and I'm happy to debate whether it's 20 billion, 40 billion, 60 billion, do I hear 80 billion? If you have that much money, it's not that you have to think about where you're going to get your next 5,000. It's that you start to think about ideology as a way to tell a story about the way things are now and should be eternally. Which brings me to the most interesting thing that Ilyin offers. This philosopher Ilyin, who Putin had dug up and whom Putin cites, he says that the facts of the world are not true. Okay, that's a very interesting idea. It sounds like a very 21st century idea, but it's actually it's a basic fascist notion. It's not that the facts of the everyday experience are not what matters. What matters is what makes us feel like we're together, right? Truth is not the same thing as factuality. Factuality is irrelevant. The whole world, says Eileen, is corrupt and spoiled. It doesn't matter what I'm feeling or what you're thinking. All that matters, the only truth is some kind of totality. That's truth. And Eileen says that it's Russia who has the capacity to lead the world back into truth, by which he doesn't mean factual truth. There's no such thing as factual truth. Truth in the sense of some kind of higher entity. So no matter what Russia looks like, even though Russia looks like, it looks the way that it looks, it has inside of the deep invisible potential. That's also a very nice idea because it excuses everything Russia does. But it also means that you can't lie, right? So let's say you use your cyber budget to project into the United States all kinds of lies about Hillary Clinton. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Because there is no truth about Hillary Clinton. There's no truth about anything at all, which leads me to the place where we are. So now that I brought us up to the 21st century, I just want to say a word about globalization. The way globalization was supposed to work is that if you think back, 1989, the end of history, the world is flat, all these ideas. The way globalization was supposed to work was that we are already a model democracy, and we're just going to project our ideal outwards. Basically, we're going to put our feet up on the beach, and the rest of the world is going to learn to become democratic by looking at, I don't know, I was about to say our beautiful naked body, but somehow that doesn't, as a nation, somehow, I feel like, that's maybe not the best. So I'm just going to stop that sentence right in the middle. So the rest of the world is just going to contemplate us because we're going to project outwards this model of liberal democracy. That's not what actually, I know this is not news to anyone at this point, but that's not what actually happened. What actually happened was that beginning about 12 years ago, this turned around completely. The last 12 years have seen the collapse of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism pretty much everywhere in the world. And with respect to us in particular, we haven't, no, this is not news to any of you, but we're not actually such a great democracy. And we've become less of a democracy in the last decade in several important material respects. And here's the globalization part. Everybody knows that, right? The only people who don't know that are us. This is the very special thing about globalization. It allows you to be trapped in your own misconceptions about yourself, while the rest of the world can see what your weaknesses actually are, right? So what globalization then can go dark. You can be in a situation, which is where we are, where we can tell ourselves, we're still in this world of progress, we're a democracy, but Russians looking at us, who have no concern, right, for our future, Russians looking at us can see our problems, and they can look into them and try to make them worse. And this is where we're going to get to the point of the book. This is what they have to do, because you see, the thing that I've described in Russia, it's not just a reality. It's a predicament. The predicament. So the way the politics of eternity feels when it's good is we're innocent, we're right. Right? We're on the right side. The outsiders are always attacking us again and again. This is what Eileen says. This is what all philosophers or politicians of eternity say. It feels good to always be right. If you're in a marriage, you know all about this. It feels good to always be right. No, I remember one of my dear departed great uncles said, his advice about marriage was, you just remember that 60% of the time you're wrong. Okay. That's hard. Come on, that's hard, right? How many of us in relationships could actually live up to 60%? I think a good tolerant partner is at 5 or 7%. Okay. I love to see where the laughter comes from, right? That man knows life. Okay. Where was my point was? Oh, okay. So my point was that the eternity feels nice when you're in it, right? But it's a problem for you as a political system. If you don't have a succession principle, you don't have a future. If you don't have social advancement, right? If you don't have social mobility, because you don't have the rule of law, because wealth is concentrated and permanently concentrated, you also don't have a future. So what you need to do is keep your society constantly in the present, right? So you have to govern by way of spectacle. Another thing you have to do is you have to convince your society that it's not better anywhere else. And this is an authentically new thing, I think, about the 21st century. In the 20th century, for better or for worse, countries generally had ideas about how things might be better. And sometimes they would try to project those ideas onto other countries, again, for better or worse. In the 21st century, we have something new, which I call in the book strategic relativism. The idea that actually things aren't good anywhere. Now, why would that be a way of governing? Because if you're Russia, if there is no succession principle, if there's no social advancement, Russians are going to think, well, what about Ukraine? What about Europe? What about America? Aren't things different there? And in order to make your domestic policy work, you have to make things look no better in Ukraine, in Europe, and in America, right? And partly you can do that by way of propaganda. And those of you who, like me, watch lots of Russian television can know how skillfully this is done. But also, you can do it by messing around with reality. The easiest way to make Ukraine or Europe or America not look good is to make them not look good, which might seem like an incredibly demanding thing, right? When I was reading the Russian press and when I was reading interviews with Russian soldiers in 2014 during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and they were talking about how they were actually invading the United States. And when I was reading, from there was a commander, security commander, a man called Antufiev, who was in Ukraine in 2014, and he was talking about how Ukraine's a disintegrating state, just like the United States, and it's all one war. Or when Sergei Glazyev, who was Mr. Putin's advisor on European affairs and economics, talked about how in order to win the war in Ukraine, we have to, what's the word he used, terminate the American elite. That could seem overambitious, and in 2014, it was easy to kind of laugh at that, maybe. And the way our government reacted was to say, oh, Russia's just a regional power, right? This doesn't really matter. But interestingly, it does matter, because what you do from position of the politics of eternity is you try to change the rules of the game. You try to make everything psychological. You try to make everything subjective. When Mr. Obama said, Russia's just a regional power, like if I had the power to go back and rewrite Mr. Obama's speeches, that would be one of the things I would take out. And here's why. It misses the point. Sure, if the world is all about economics and technology in some objective way, then California wins and America gets dragged along. Great. But okay, sorry, this is not a pro-California audience, I see. All right. So I'll start again. If it really is about economics and technology, then America wins. Especially the Northeast. Especially Yale's West Campus, where it all happens. Okay, just a little populist trial balloon right there. But what if that's not really the way the world works, right? What if economics and technology doesn't automatically translate into how people feel about things? What if you can go directly into how people feel about things? What if, ironically, the very technologies which we think have propelled us into progress, namely the internet, what if those very technologies make it rather easy for people to get into our minds and affect us psychologically, right? What if that's actually what happened? This is Russia's gambit. If you're dealt a weak hand, what do? I know the answer to this because I have small children. You play a different game. You play a different game. Russia's not playing the game of who's got the most fighters, who's got the best technology. They're playing the game of how do we feel about the future? Are we anxious? Are we afraid? Who are our enemies? Are they internal? Are they external? That's the game they're playing, and that's the game, by the way, that they're winning, right? So think about it this way. Which costs more, an F-35 or the entire Russian cyber budget? An F-35 by a lot. The tires, of an F-35. Almost cost as much as the Russian cyber budget. Okay, so right? Which would you rather have? Not you personally. Which would you rather have, right? If you wanted to change the world, like if you wanted to fly something over the Super Bowl, okay, I'd rather fly the F-35, right? But if you really wanted to change the world, so Russia, this is the point, Russia has a domestic problem, right? Eternity is a way of governing, but it creates a problem, and the problem is since you don't have a future, since you've thrown the future away, you have to persuade everybody else that there are no alternatives in the rest of the world. The best way to do that, or one way to do that, is to start messing around with the rest of the world. And the way that you do that is that you make things psychological. You take distrust, here's another way of thinking about it. You take distrust and you export it. Okay, this is another 21st century thing. In the 20th century, governments wanted their people to believe them. Okay? That's not necessarily true anymore. The Russian government knows that its people don't really believe it. Their attitude is, yeah, you don't believe us, that's fine. Just don't believe anybody else either, because there is no truth at all. And that turns a corner in what nationalism means, because nationalism then becomes, I prefer our lies to other people's lies, right? And that is what 21st century is very much like. And again, not only in Russia, right? I mean, there's a growing part of the American population which more or less openly says, I just really like these lies that make me feel really good. Okay, now let me try to be more specific about how this actually happens, and then we'll have some time to talk. So all of this that I've been talking about, it's first applied to Europe. So I know, like, you want me to jump to Trump, and I promise I'll talk about Trump before it's all over. But in a way, my goal is to keep that to the very end, because it's so easy to just talk about the man as though the man was the problem. The man's not the problem. I mean, he's a problem, but he's not the problem. The problem is how we got to a point where that's possible. And the one thing in the world that we're not going to actually change is Mr. Trump. Right? I mean, Mr. Trump is the way Mr. Trump is. Neither you nor I is going to have a meaningful, therapeutic, romantic, or any other kind of relationship with Mr. Trump that's going to change him, right? What we can think about is changing the society around him, changing ourselves, or seeing the things which allow us. Okay, so all of this begins with Europe. Europe is, in all of this, more important than we are. More democracies, a bigger economy, right? Isn't it interesting how, like, on Fox News every day they never say the European Union economy is once again bigger than the American economy, right? Isn't it amazing? I mean, not just Fox. I mean, we don't. Does anyone ever say that ever in the American media, right? Never, right? And by the way, Canada doesn't exist. So, but I've got. But since mine is a history book, right? I'm trying to, like, douse us in reality. I have to say that Europe matters more, because Europe is next to Russia, and Europe is a much more meaningful model in many ways than we are for Russia. And what the Russians do to Europe starting in 2013 is they turn this whole idea of subjectivity against them. They take the things that Europeans already believe. They take tendencies that are inside Europe towards a politics of eternity and try to make them stronger, right? So Europeans, the way that European history has worked, I teach a whole class on this, and I'm now going to do the whole thing in a sentence. So like, you're sorry that you went to that whole semester. The way that European history works is that European states used to be empires, and now they're an integration project. That's it, in a sentence. The way that Europeans think it works is that they have a long, glorious history of nation states, which actually never happened. Never happened. Didn't happen. And so their politics of inevitability is, we wise Europeans learned that war was bad, and we started to cooperate economically. Their politics of eternity is, but we could always go back to the nation because we had the nation. What Russia does is it pushes them towards the nation, right? So it runs all kinds of internet news platforms in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, meant to instruct people that the European Union is very dangerous and they should go back to the nation, because the European Union is all about gays and gypsies and migrants and gay gypsy migrants, in France they subsidize the Front National, which is the major anti-European party. In Germany, they use their bots to support Alternative für Deutschland, which is the far-right anti-European party in Germany. In Britain, they use their bots and several other means to support Brexit, right? The idea that the United Kingdom should leave the European Union. All of this, what this has in common is that they're spinning the Europeans in a certain direction. Outside of this integration project, which has brought them peace, prosperity, democracy, all these boring things, and towards the exciting abyss of becoming a nation state, which you've never actually done before, but you think you have. Now, Europe's in the center of this story, and it begins in 2013. The way that the European experience, or the way that Russian policy towards Europe starts to bleed into American policy is with Ukraine in 2014. And it has to do with what the Russians learn about us in 2014. So what happens in 2014 is pretty straightforward. Many Ukrainians want to get closer to the European Union. There is an association agreement, a kind of a very complex trade agreement, which Ukraine was going to sign. Many young Ukrainians thought this was a very good thing because they wanted a European future. Many Ukrainian businessmen and women thought it was a good thing because it would help with the rule of law. At the last moment, the Ukrainian president pulled out, having received threats and promises from Russia. That led to protests. The protests were put down by force, and then Russia invaded the country. Okay. Not terribly complicated, but how did we experience those events? Did we experience them in terms of the simple, people want to become closer to Europe, Russia invaded? No. We experienced them in terms of the Russian politics of eternity. In the first half of 2014, indeed through most of 2014, we were thinking things, or we were being told things like, this is about the conversion to Christianity 1,000 years ago, or this is about the Russian Empire, this is about the Second World War, this is about Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, this is about ancient hatreds, it's about a line across the country, and all the American newspapers published maps of Ukraine with lines down the middle of them. That's what the politics of eternity feels like, right? And we went for it. And the fact that we went for it was a very important lesson for Russia. Not about Ukraine. The Ukrainians didn't go for that, most of them. But we went for that hard, and the Europeans went for it. That was one of several ploys, or several ways, that Russia began to export the politics of eternity during 2014, during 2015, during the war in Ukraine. Another is what I call implausible deniability, which is when a leader stands up and says something that you know is not true, and he knows that you know it's not true, and it's big, and he says it anyway, and then he just asks what you're going to do. So in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what Mr. Putin said, and again, this is pretty new. It's not 20th century, it's 21st century. Russia invades a country, and Mr. Putin stands up and says, we did not invade a country. Those people you think are soldiers are actually locals who bought camouflage at the local army surplus store. That's literally what he said. Now, what does that do? It's a challenge to the whole journalistic profession, because it's very tempting to cover this larger-than-life character who seems to be able to say whatever he wants. It's hard to go cover the artillery and the refugees, right? It's easy to cover this larger-than-life character who's going to keep saying these colorful things that aren't true. And if you cover him, what you're doing is you're turning a real war into reality television. And you're putting this person who makes stuff up, you're turning him into the hero of this reality television program, right? So you see how this is familiar, right? That is a way of governing. Another thing about Ukraine, which then bleeds into us, is the way that Russia handles surprise. So you can have the most masterful propaganda, you can control all the television stations, you can have philosophy, you can have it all, you can have the whole package, but sometimes things will happen that you don't expect. Like, for example, you're invading a neighboring country and you accidentally shoot down a civilian airliner, which Russia did. What do you then do? You don't deny it, right? Because if you deny it, you're accepting the framework of discussion that you either did or didn't do it. That's a losing move. And even on the very day when Russia shot down MH17, they didn't do that. They were not thrown off their game. What they did instead was they came up with a bunch of different versions of what happened. So the main one the first day was the Ukrainians shot down the plane because they mistook it for Putin's presidential plane, which was plausible in the sense that like both planes had two wings and they both flew. They were both in Europe at the time. They said Ukraine was carrying out a ground-to-air missile exercise. They said Ukrainian fighters were in the area. They said NATO was carrying out exercises. They said that a Ukrainian Jewish oligarch controlled Ukrainian airspace and did it on purpose, and we can prove it because of the shape of his nose, which was an actual story on Russian television. They said a whole bunch of stuff, right, which was not only not true, but mutually contradictory, right? The stories they're not even possibly consistent. But the point is that at the end of the day, and by the way, I mean literally at the end of the day, people have completely forgotten about the actual thing that happened. Now, if that doesn't sound familiar, I will just say Access Hollywood. That's what happened with Access Hollywood. You remember those 30 minutes when you thought that Access Hollywood was going to affect the election, right? You remember those 30 minutes when you believed it mattered that a presidential candidate endorsed sexual assault? Why didn't it matter? It didn't matter because the Russians used emails that they had hacked from John Podesta to further two stories. One was that John Podesta went to these dinner parties where he consumed human bodily fluids. I mean, you can say a lot about Mr. Podesta, but that one just ain't true. Or that Hillary Clinton was a pedophile pimp who ran a prostitution chain out of a pizza parlor in Northwest Washington, D.C. Now, that might seem ridiculous, just like the idea that the Ukrainians were trying to shoot down the presidential airplane of Russia might seem ridiculous, but it completely changes the story. You don't deny. What you do is you surround with fiction. And literally at the end of the day, when Alex Jones and other people were broadcasting the Russian versions of Hillary Clinton as the sexual predator instead of Mr. Trump, it didn't matter, right? Access Hollywood didn't matter. And, just incidentally, what did Russia do in 2014 in Ukraine, which we overlooked and which might have mattered just a little bit? They tried to cyber hack the election results, which an event which was little reported here. But if you keep all those things in mind, or to look at it from my point of view, because I work on Russia and Ukraine and Europe, I don't really work on America. But for me, the striking thing about 2016 was that this was all so familiar, that none of it, Americans were saying this is all new, but none of it was new. Right? This was a pattern which had been flowing out of Russia since about 2013 into Europe, into Ukraine, and into us. And it's not just a resemblance, it's a connection. If you think about the chronology, the institutions, the Internet Research Agency, which is the Russian institution which spread these fictions about Ukraine, is the same institution which carries out cyber warfare against the United States. It's the Internet Research Agency, which within a few days of Mr. Trump's announcement that he's running for president, creates a whole new American division, hires 90 people, and gets them to work for Mr. Trump, including, at the end, actually sending people to the United States, who are then later indicted by Mr. Mueller. It's all just one story. And my point is that by treating Ukraine as something distant and irrelevant, and by instructing the Russians that we go for this kind of thing, we were basically inviting an attack, and an attack is, in the end, what we got. Which brings me to America and to Mr. Trump. So I'm going to close with this. So there are a couple of ways. I mean, so the Road to Unfreedom, the last chapter, chapter 6, that's the chapter that I wrote after On Tyranny, and it's the chapter about 2017 and about the Trump administration. The whole book was already written before Mr. Trump was elected. right? The whole book was written before Mr. Trump was elected. I was the first person to write about the Trump-Putin connection. I broke that story. And the reason I was able to break that story was that I was writing on the basis of the Russian sources and seeing this as part of a larger pattern. I wrote in summer of 2016 about Russia hacking the American elections because it was not only because I could see the evidence of it, because it was a familiar story from other places. So in the end of Road to Unfreedom, I give you the blow-by-blow of the multi-pronged attempt by Russia to choose really the American president, to change the outcome of American presidential elections. But here what I want to do is just give you a kind of general overview of how I think we should think about this. There are basically two schools of thought that I run into in my life. One of them is the school of thought that says, yeah, maybe Russia did something, but America's got big problems. So let's not talk about Russia, let's talk about America's big problems. Then there's another school of thought which says Russia did something extraordinary, it violated the sovereignty of the United States, it chose our president, we have to think about Russia, Russia, Russia. And what I want to say about this is that everybody is right, and that if we don't manage to bring those two conversations into one conversation, neither of those conversations will ever lead anywhere. Because yes, America has big problems, and the reason why Russia was able to choose our president is because they could see those problems and exploit them, which means that the only way to prevent a similar attack, because it doesn't have to be Russia, right? The only way to prevent a similar attack is to address some of these problems. At the same time, we have to recognize that it actually happened. And we have to look to Russia and see not just a country that wants to change us, but an example of how we might turn out. So let me just give you a little bit of detail about this, and then we'll be done. So what did Russia actually do? Very briefly. It created Mr. Trump, right? If Russia doesn't fund this totally failed, 6-time bankrupt who's completely uncreditworthy in the 1990s and 2000s, he doesn't exist. If he doesn't exist, he doesn't have a public profile. If he doesn't have a public profile, he can't run for president of the United States. That's one. Two, personnel. There has never been an American presidential campaign which is so thoroughly penetrated by a foreign country. If you look at the careers of people like Mr. Page or Mr. Papadopoulos, if you look at the investments of Mr. Ross, if you look at the moral commitments of Mr. Flynn, if you look at the behavior of Jared Kushner or Trump Jr., or even Trump himself, who is retweeting Russian material during the campaign, you see there's never been a collection of individuals like this. And the Mueller investigation only scratches the surface of it because Mueller can only go after things which are actually crimes, right? The third thing are the email hacks. Russia getting into the Democratic Party's email. This matters a lot, not just because they can drop email bombs later, which they do, but it also changes the entire atmosphere of the election. If you're in the Democratic Party, your donors' private information is out there, and your donors are getting calls in the middle of the night, and if you're the Democratic Party, your campaign workers' phone numbers are known, and they're getting death threats during the convention. These things change the atmospherics of a campaign, right? It doesn't matter about the Democrats or Republicans at this point. It's that one party does not have to run a campaign in those conditions, and another party does. The third thing that they do is the social media campaign. So they are involved in social media, especially on Facebook, creating sites that people read. So 10GOP, a site that purports to be the Tennessee Republican Party, but which is actually a Russian site, has 10 times more followers than the actual Tennessee Republican Party does, right? That matters. And the messages that 10GOP are spreading are retweeted by people like Sean Hannity or Kellyanne Conway or Michael Flynn. In other words, very important people who serve important functions in the campaign and then the administration are becoming conduits or really elements of a Russian propaganda campaign. And then, of course, there's rescuing him with the bot campaign after Access Hollywood, right? That also seems to be rather important. So you have the Russian choice of our president, and now we see the consequences. If you don't know what stand Mr. Trump is going to take on an issue, all you have to do is ask what Russia would like it to be, right? It really is that simple. And there are not any exceptions, basically. There are no major exceptions. Whether it's climate change, whether it's our diplomatic corps, whether it's our relations with our allies, whether it's our policy towards Syria, whatever your favorite area of foreign policy is, it's pretty easy to answer what at least the presidential administration is going to be trying to do. So Russia did something. On the other hand, and that's something that they did. What it does is it pushes us towards the politics of eternity, right? Because all of our problems are only going to get worse. And we're going to be tempted to think about making America great again and not about a future. We're going to be drawn into a daily news cycle where we feel pounded and abused and overwhelmed and outraged, or maybe elated if we like it. But we're going to forget about the future. We are forgetting about the future. This is happening. But my point here is, it couldn't happen if it weren't for the vulnerability, right? So the logical argument, the philosophical argument, if you want, in the book is that the politics of inevitability, this sense in progress, this sleepwalk towards the future, it opens you up for the politics of eternity. It prepares you to be shocked. If you think, like a lot of Americans think, that capitalism is just going to bring democracy, which I heard a lot of smart people say, smart, powerful people say for a long time, then you might think, well, more free market will just bring more democracy. But the thing is, it also brings wealth inequality. Wealth inequality in the US is now as bad as it was in 1929. And conditions of wealth inequality make democracy hard because people have trouble believing in democracy if they don't see a future. And there's a reason why the current young generation in America, the current young generation in America believes in democracy less than any generation that we've ever polled. I think that's the main reason. Or if you think the market just brings democracy, you'd think, well, free markets would be great. But what does a free market actually look like? A free market is banks who can do business with anonymous clients. A free market is anonymous real estate. Because why should there be regulations saying that I have to put my name on a lease or a contract? Why? That's the government interfering in my affairs. So in Delaware, there's a building where there are 285,000 companies registered. That's what the free market looks like. The free market means shell companies. That is the world. The free market means 7 to 21 trillion American dollars offshored. That's what a free market looks like. And that free market creates the zone of lawlessness, or the gray zone, where people like Mr. Trump, who don't believe in the rule of law, can meet Russian friends who come out of a system where there isn't the rule of law. And that is exactly what happened. Mr. Trump's first contacts with Russians were with people who were buying apartments in Trump Tower in order to launder money in the 1990s. Or jumping ahead to 2016, 70% of the purchases of Trump real estate from the point of his nomination to the point of his election were by anonymous shell companies, right? So his campaign was funded by anonymous entities from outside the United States, from guess where, who were buying his apartment units. That zone that we chose to create makes this kind of politics possible. Or the opioid crisis. If you really think the market's going to solve everything, then, why should we have healthcare? Why not just let big companies dish out the pills? How about every time somebody, hurts themselves in West Virginia, they get 1,000 pills? And that may seem like an obscure example, but it's not. The opioid crisis, which is continuing to get worse in the U.S., by the way, changes the way people think about life. If you're addicted to opioids or to anything similar, life for you is a cycle. There isn't a future. Things just go round and round. You're just looking until the next hit, till the next hit, till the next hit. And how did Trump win the election? Well, every single county he flipped in Pennsylvania, every one is an opioid crisis. Every county he flipped in Ohio, except for one, is an opioid crisis. He won massively in places that are in public health crisis across the country. That's something that we did to ourselves, right? We made people see the world that way. Or technology. Part of our politics of inevitability was the idea that technology had to bring progress, that the internet had to enlighten people. That just turns out not to be true. I'm just sorry. It just ain't so. I mean, there are many good ways to use the internet, but the rise of the internet has coincided in time with the collapse of democracy around the world. That's just the case. And there are reasons why this is true. The internet breaks up our ability to concentrate. It takes us out of the three-dimensional spaces, which are necessary for honest communication. And it closes us down into a world of us and them. And of course, it created the conduit, it created the avenue along which Russia could carry out its attack on the United States. which is also not a small thing. When the Russians talk about war, they're right. The Russians all the time talk about how they're at war with us. I mean, unless they're speaking English and it's like a very diplomatic situation in which they say, no, of course we're not. What are you thinking? But when they're talking to themselves, the word they use all the time is war. And they're not joking, right? It doesn't have to be combat to be war. The great student of war, Clausewitz, said that war is about breaking the will of the enemy. Combat is a means to that end. But what, and this is what Russian military doctrine now says, what if you can skip the whole step of combat and break the enemy's will directly? What if you can mobilize what they call the protest potential of the population to turn the country against itself? What if you can do that? What if that's already happened? What if that is what just happened? So we have opened ourselves up for this. When we say that there are no alternatives, we blind ourselves to them. We don't see them when they're coming, which is one reason why it's so important to have history. And this is the last thing that I want to say. This is a book that not only is a history book, it's a book which is meant to make a case for history. So it's a very conservative history book in every respect except for one. It goes forward in time. It uses lots of primary sources. It uses sources in the proper languages. At the beginning, it's almost all Russian sources. Then we move through other languages till we get to English at the end. It's a book which develops an interpretation on the basis of facts. The only thing which is not conservative about it as a history book is it is about the present. But it's a history book, and it's a history book which is trying to make the case that we have to have history to have freedom and to have democracy as we've understood these things. So if you're in the politics of inevitability, as so many of us have been and some of us still are, you're not moving away, you're not moving towards freedom, you're moving away from it. If you say history is over and we have to be free, what is that? That's not freedom, right? That's imagining that the world is working for you. That's not the same thing as freedom. If you say that there's no alternative to freedom, that's not saying that you're free. It's just saying, the world is such that I have to be free. That's the opposite of what a free person would say. If you're a free person, you're always working a little bit against the world. If your claim is that everything has to be such that I'm free, you have a problem. And that's the problem that we had. If you're in the politics of eternity and you think, well, the only thing that ever happens is the other people are going to come around for us over and over and over again, you're also not in history, right? You're in another idea of time. So what I'm saying and what I'm struggling for, that's not too, ambitious a word, what I'm struggling for is a sense of forward time, which is not determined, which is not heading in any particular direction. Inevitability is not true. It's comfortable, but it's not true. Eternity, comfortable. It's very comfortable always to be innocent, right? It's very comfortable always to be the victim, no matter who you are. If you're Russia, if you're America, if you're Mr. Trump, he's always a victim. It's very comfortable to be a victim all the time. It's very comfortable to think that things are always going to turn out. Those ideas of time are comfortable. They're just not true. History is not comfortable. What history does is that it forces us to look around and say, this is the actual state of things. These are what the structures are. And then within these structures, you can ask, what can I do? And then this is why the book lands where On Tyranny starts. If you see the structures for what they are, if you see both the risks and the opportunities for what they are, then you have to ask, what can I do? And with that question comes a kindred question, which is, what should I do? Once you recognize that in some measure it's up to you, which it is, because that's what history says. History doesn't say it's all going to be fine. History also doesn't say it's all going to be terrible, right? History says, here are the opportunities, here are the cracks, here are the ways that you could make a difference. Once you ask, what can I do? Then you have to ask, what should I do? And I will say the most conservative thing I can possibly think of. This means that history is about good and evil. Because history, if you take it seriously, if you recognize your place in history, if you see what you can do, and then you ask the question, what should I do? You're asking, what's right? What's good? And we need history for that. Thank you.